Have you ever noticed something strange about the world's richest people? Some own private jets worth more than $70 million. Others, despite having a larger fortunes, refuse to buy one. At first, that makes no sense. If money isn't the problem, why would a billionaire wait for someone else's aircraft? The answer has nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with economics because a private jet isn't a simple airplane. It's a financial decision that can either create extraordinary value or quietly consume millions of dollars without anyone noticing. Every year, thousands of private jets lift off from airports across the United States. On board are Fortune 500 executives, entrepreneurs closing billion-dollar deals, professional athletes, entertainers, and investors whose schedules are worth more than most people's annual salaries. From outside, every departure looks effortless. The engine starts, the aircraft accelerates. Minutes later, it climbs above the clouds. What nobody sees is the economic machine that started long before the wheels left the runway. Most people assume the biggest expense is buying the airplane. That's the obvious answer. It's also the wrong one. A brand new business jet can cost anywhere from $5 million to over $70 million, depending on its size and range. Those numbers sound unbelievable, but here's the first surprise. For many owners, writing the check isn't the hardest part. Keeping the aircraft for the next 10 years is. But can spending millions of dollars on a private jet actually saves even more money? At first, that sounds impossible. After everything we have seen, the massive purchase price, the endless maintenance bills, the salaries, the insurance, you did accept the economics to get worse. Instead, this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the people who are buying private jets aren't trying to save money, they are trying to maximize time. And sometimes those two things become exactly the same. Imagine you are the CEO of a company generating $500 million a year. On Monday morning, you need to meet new investors in New York. By afternoon, you are expected in Chicago to negotiate a $1 billion acquisition. That evening, your engineering team is waiting in Dallas. The next morning, there is a board meeting in Miami using a commercial airline. Their schedule simply doesn't exist. Flight not leave when you are ready. They leave when the airline decides. A delayed flight, a missed connection, or a cancelled departure can destroy the entire stay schedule. For most people, that's frustrating. For a company negotiating $1 billion contracts, it can be incredibly expensive. Suddenly, the private jets isn't replacing the plane ticket, it's replacing lost opportunities. And opportunities are much harder to measure than fuel cost. That's why corporation doesn't calculate the value of a private jet in the same way an average traveler would. They calculate something far more important, opportunity cost. Every hour an executive spends waiting in an airport is an hour they are not meeting clients, negotiating deals, inspecting factories, or solving problems inside their businesses. To most people, an hour is simply a 60 minutes. To a Fortune 500 CEO, that same hour might influence decisions worth millions of dollars. Now, the economics begin to change. Because once time becomes your most valuable asset, saving 4 or 5 hours on every trip start producing returns that don't appear anywhere on the aircraft's balance sheet. There is another advantage that is even more valuable, flexibility. Commercial airlines operates on fixed schedules. Private aviation operates on your schedule. If a meeting ends early, you leave early. If another city suddenly becomes more important, the destination changes. If an emergency happens, the aircraft can be ready within hours. That kind of flexibility is almost impossible to buy anywhere else. And for businesses operating across multiple states, it can be a genuine competitive advantage. But here is something that most people never consider. A private jet doesn't just save times during flights, it creates time before and after every flight. No arriving hours early, no crowded terminals, no security lines stretching across the airport, no waiting beside hundreds of strangers. Instead, a vehicle pulls directly onto the private terminal. You walk inside, meet the crew, board the aircraft, and within minutes you are already taxiing towards the runway. A process that might take 4 hours at commercial airport can often take less than 30 minutes through private aviation. When that happens dozens of times every year, the hours saved become astonishing. But here's the question nobody asks. If private jets creates more value, why doesn't every successful company own one? Because this is exactly where the economics becomes complicated. Owning the aircraft isn't always the smartest decision. Sometimes renting one produces better financial result. That's where the business model behind private aviation become more fascinating and where millions of dollars can be saved or wasted with a single decision. The most expensive way to fly privately is to own the entire airplane. That sounds strange. After all, if you are flying private dozens of times every year, wouldn't ownership eventually makes more sense? Not necessarily, because there is a hidden problem inside every private jet sitting in a hangar. Isn't it flying? And an aircraft that isn't flying isn't generating value. Imagine spending 50 million on a jet and you might use it several hundred hours a year. But the aircraft itself is capable of flying thousands of hours. The rest of that time it's sitting on the ground and you are still paying for it. That's one of the biggest reasons some companies choose a completely different strategy. Instead of buying the aircraft, they buy access to aircraft. This is where private aviation gets interesting. A company can charter a jet only when it needs one. No purchase price, no permanent crew, no long-term hangar commitment, no responsibility for an aircraft sitting idle for weeks. You simply pay for the flight and when the trip is over, the financial obligations ends with it. But there is even more sophisticated options. Fractional ownership. Instead of owning 100% of an aircraft, multiple customers own shares of it. Think of it, buying a percentage of a very expensive machine. You don't need to pay for the entire airplane. You pay for your portion, and in exchange, you receive access to the aircraft for certain numbers of flight hours. For frequent travelers, this can create an interesting middle ground. You get many of the advantages of ownership without taking on the entire cost. But even fractional ownership has a catch because the moment you start adding management fees, maintenance, depreciations, and guaranteed availability, the economics becomes much more complicated. And this is where smart companies start asking a very different question. Not, we can afford a private jet, but how many hours we will actually use it? That single question can completely change the answer. If a company only leads private aviations for a few times a year, ownership can be incredibly inefficient. Charting may make more sense. If the company flies constantly, fractional ownership could become more attractive. And if executives are flying hundreds of hours every year, full ownership might finally begin to make financial sense. So there isn't the one answer. There is a break-even point, a point where economics shift from one model to another, and finding that point is where the real financial strategy begins. Because private aviation isn't really about owning a jet, it's about controlling access, time, and flexibility at the lowest possible economic cost. And once you understand that, you can finally calculate something most people never do. Exactly how many hours you need to fly before owning the jet actually becomes cheaper. That's why the number gets really interesting. So, is owning a private jet worth it? The answer is simple. It depends on how you use it. If you fly a few times a year, then chartering may make more sense. If you fly constantly, ownership can become more far attractive because the real value of a private jet isn't the airplane itself, it's the time, flexibility, and the access it gives you. For a billionaire, saving 5 hours might be worth millions. For a business, being able to reach the right city at the right time can mean close a deal that changes the company. But for someone who doesn't fly enough, that same jet can become nothing more than a very expensive asset sitting on the ground. And that's the biggest lesson. The richest people aren't necessarily buying private jets because they want to look rich. They are asking a different question. Does owning this asset creates more value than it costs? Because at this level, wealth isn't about spending money, it's about allocating capital intelligently. And sometimes the smarter decision isn't owning the jet, it's knowing when not to. That's the real economics of owning a private jet.